Armed with David Lee's Gaussian copula function, people got to work really quickly securitizing mortgages that were issued by a number of different kinds of shady operators throughout the United States. And what I mean by this is not that every mortgage that was sold was necessarily of questionable quality, only that there were several mortgages of questionable quality, which were initiated by mortgage lenders like Washington Mutual, that were ultimately sold off and repackaged for institutional investors the world over. Now, reasonably speaking, when we look at the purchasing of a securitized portfolio of debts, what we typically see is what we call tranching. Tranching is a structured finance term, can be approximately, visualized using this sort of cash waterfall model. What we have here is the cash flowing in from the top from all of the over collateralized portfolio of securities that have been sold off to the SIV. So student loans, car loans, home mortgages, et cetera. These are all the cash payments coming in every month or every couple of weeks from the people who have borrowed this money. That flows into what they call the ultra senior tranche, i.e. these are the first batch of people to get paid. They have a claim on, let's say, 60 or 70% of the cash that comes in, not proportional to what comes in, but the first 60 or 70% of cash that comes in, meaning that no one else beneath them in the priority scale gets paid 1 penny until the ultra senior tranche has been paid in full. As you might imagine, this makes it the lowest risk tranche out of the entire batch. But once it's filled up, water drips over, or cash flows over into the next tranche, the senior tranche. Once it's been paid in full, the mezzanine tranche collects. Once the mezzanine tranche has collected in full, then and only then can the equity tranche necessarily collect anything at all. So what we have along the way is increasing amounts of risk in each one of these tranches. And each of these tranches is used to back a particular bond that's been issued by an SIV. Meaning, of course, that the bonds backed by the ultra senior tranche have the highest ratings and the lowest interest rates, while those that are of the equity tranche have the lowest bond ratings that offer the highest potential rates of return. Now, of course, in many cases, the equity tranche was simply recycled back into another batch of cash, hoping ultimately to spread around some of this toxic waste risk into other securities and effectively dilute it across the industry. However, what we frequently saw was an exponentially rising complexity in valuing these kinds of securities called collateralized debt obligations. You ended up with CDO squareds or CDO cubes, depending on the number of times that the equity tranche was remixed back into a batch and then follows through that same sort of tranching procedure over and over again, with the worst risks constantly being remixed back into the portfolio. Now, of course, many of these seemingly safe portfolios were less safe than people might have otherwise imagined. Many of these were constructed simply on the basis of the Gaussian copula function's risk modeling, and of course, the ubiquitous credit default swaps, which were largely being sold by AIG. Armed with these two tools, an estimate of the risk and somebody else to take on the default risk, what we saw was institutional investors around the world piling into these kinds of securities, hoping to capture just a tiny little bit more yield than they otherwise would have earned in the fairly low interest rate environments of the early 2000s. Now, there were, of course, some critical problems with this sort of tranching behavior, right? And while they may have been granted relatively high quality ratings by the ratings agencies, there are real concerns about the incentives that the rating agencies had to provide these kinds of ratings. In fact, we have evidence that several investment banks actually turned to the ratings agencies and asked them what would be required for us to restructure certain securities to ensure that they earned a AAA, i.e. the highest credit rating possible, so that they could be sold to investors at the highest price. So not only were the ratings agencies to some extent complicit with the investment banks in marketing very risky securities as being very safe securities, but we also see considerable pressure being put onto people working at the ratings agencies, where in some cases they were handed literally dozens of case files in a day and told, you need to evaluate all of these before your work for the day is done on a salaried basis, which of course means that over time, the quality of the analysis being done by the ratings agencies begins to erode. And we start to see a shift more towards handling volumes of ratings as opposed to necessarily focusing on the quality of certain ratings. And this ultimately led to sometimes even the flimsiest mortgage-backed securities ultimately receiving incredibly high ratings, such that institutional investors around the world believed they were buying securities that were as safe as US government debt. Nothing, unfortunately, could have been further from the truth. And it's pretty clear that several organizations within the financial industry were aware of this. One particular party that drew a great deal of opprobrium in this was Goldman Sachs, who not only knew enough about the risks associated with these securities to take a short position themselves and thus hedge their exposure to them, but some of them actually investment bankers at Goldman Sachs actually created portfolios of mortgage-backed securities which were designed to fail. They were created specifically so that certain clients could bet against the market. Meanwhile, these same securities were being bundled up by Goldman Sachs and sold unwittingly to public institution investors. So what Goldman was doing was selling things they knew were going to fail to some clients, specifically so that other more favored clients could bet against the price on those kinds of securities. Here's an example of the kind of securitization Goldman Sachs was building. This one happened to be issued in spring of 2006, the GS Amp Trust 2006 S3. This portfolio, this securitized portfolio of mortgages, contained 8,274 California second mortgages that had a notional value of $493 million. The first mortgages on these houses generally were about 80% loan to value. Now, it's important to know the difference between a first and second mortgage. A first mortgage has primary claim on the asset. A second mortgage is literally trying to claim additional equity that might be available in the house, but are generally seen as being much, much riskier because they represent a secondary claim on the value of a house that is only enforceable after the primary claim of the first mortgage has been paid in full. And that means, of course, that secondary mortgages can't foreclose on a property provided that the primary is getting paid. Now, average equity in these 8,274 mortgages was approximately 0.71%. In other words, 99.29% of the value of these houses was being financed with debt. Of these 8,300 mortgages, roughly 58% of them had no or low documentation, what was known in the industry at the time as a ninja loan, no income or no job or assets applicants. In many of these cases, people were allowed to fill out their own employment applications, stating how much they made without any verification being made of their actual employment status. On top of it, many of these mortgages had what were called teaser rates, whereby an interest rate on a 5-year mortgage would start off low at, say, 1%, but then systematically rise throughout the life of the mortgage, such that in the last 2 to 3 years, a borrower might be paying a mortgage rate that was as much as twice the amount they had seen at the beginning years of their mortgage term. Now, when we take a look at this, 93% of the mortgages in this portfolio were rated investment grade, according to the credit default swap prices that David Lee's Gaussian copula function used to estimate the risk. As a result of this type of risk modeling, the expected rate of default was just 1%. And of course, the SIV happened to be over collateralized, so this seemed like a very safe and highly rated security. Within just a year, 18% of the mortgages in this securitization were in default, meaning that the ultra safe tier of securities, the ones that were rated AA and AAA, ultimately proved to be exposed to dramatically more risk than any of their investors had previously thought. And when enough of these securitizations started to go bad, ultimately, someone had to be left holding all of that toxic waste risk that was left over from the equity tranches. And that's what helped to precipitate the September 15th, 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers.